Major funding for devastation to restoration provided by the Bureau of Reclamation and the Bureau of Land Management. Additional funding provided by Horsedown Clear Creek Preserve.
The past 150 years has been a fascinating journey for those who use and work the land. Our understanding of nature has evolved from total indifference, assuming that no matter what we did, nature would eventually fix it, to a partnership where we're actually learning how nature works, and together we're healing the scars of the past. Some past land uses were so devastating, nature didn't have a chance of healing it alone. The rebirth of Lower Clear Creek in Shasta County, California, is a story that begins with devastation but ends with restoration. It's a story of partnerships with agencies and community groups working together for over 15 years to restore this watershed turned upside down by gold and gravel mining. Before the gold rush, most rivers and creeks in California were home to thousands of Chinook salmon and steelhead, treasured by Native Americans as a food source. But when gold was discovered in 1848, the gold rush began and the life cycle of salmon became an afterthought.
Well, Clear Creek has a rich history of mining, starting with the second gold strike in California, upstream from this spot on Redding Bar, where Pearson B. Redding found discovery of gold after, no doubt, fueled from the gold fever from the Marshall discovery down towards Sacramento. There were several towns along Clear Creek, all devoted to mining. And the early period of mining was all placer mining. And essentially that's taking the soil up, running water through it, and water away from it, leaving the gold behind.
Gold and then gravel mining in Clear Creek continued to turn the watershed upside down well into the 20th century. In 1903, as more people moved into the area, irrigation water was needed, so a diversion dam was built across the creek at Seltzer Gorge. It was the first barrier to salmon migration on the creek. In 1935, the Federal Central Valley Project began constructing dams and canals in California to improve irrigation for agriculture, reduce flooding, and generate electrical power. By 1963, Whiskeytown Dam was constructed on Clear Creek, which divided the watershed in two and created a permanent barrier to fish migration. Some water behind the dam was permanently diverted to other areas, decreasing the water flow in Lower Clear Creek by 60%. The dam also blocked the natural flow of gravel that created the spawning beds used by salmon. By 1967, the average fall run of Chinook salmon returning to Clear Creek was less than 1,700 fish per year.
Well, with the creation of Whiskeytown Dam in the early 60s, it was no longer feasible for fish to get upstream or gravel to come downstream. So now Clear Creek was probably at its worst by about 1980 biologically.
In the 1970s and 80s, ecology and the health of natural resources became a hot topic at universities and research centers around the country. By the mid-1990s, industry, agencies, and environmental groups in Shasta County finally found something they could all agree on. Together we can restore Lower Clear Creek.
The stars aligned just right, and we ended up with a group of people that were all willing to work together, give up their individual needs, their own agencies or organizations' needs or desires in order to try to fix this watershed. And without that, it could have never happened.
I think we're really a lot stronger group because we have folks from different disciplines. We have folks who deal with the avian species. We have folks who look at how the creek functions from the perspective of the rocks and the physical habitat, as well as the fish biologists and the ecologists and the wildlife folks.
Through the Bureau of Land Management, Land Acquisition and Disposal Program, BLM acquired through purchase or exchange lands along Clear Creek. Step by step, the Western Shasta Resource Conservation District, known as RCD, obtained grant funding to complete the plan to restore the creek. By 1999, a multi-agency technical team, including the RCD, completed a watershed analysis and management plan and created a conceptual design for the project that included recreating functional channel segments, increasing spawning habitat, repairing the floodplain, and improving the riparian habitat along the creek.
Yeah, one thing I always like to tell people about is the foresight that BLM had back in 1993 in their planning document, where they decided that they were going to focus on acquiring property in Clear Creek in order to protect the anadromous fish. And if we didn't have that here, our restoration probably wouldn't have gone nearly as far.
Well, it seemed like pretty straightforward. If we could get rid of some of the blockages like the old McCormick-Seltzer Dam, if we could increase the water flow a little bit, reintroduce the spawning gravel, because Whiskeytown Dam's done a pretty effective job of blocking any downstream movement of gravel, well, there is a hope for it to double the amount of salmon.
Graham, Matthews and Associates, experts in stream geomorphology, were hired to complete the construction design of the Lower Clear Creek Floodway Rehabilitation Project with the goal of filling in gravel pits and realigning a 1.8-mile section of the braided creek into its historical natural meander. The project was designed in 3 major phases. Phase 1, reduce salmon stranding in deep gravel pits. Phase 2, realign the braided creek and create a new floodplain. Phase 3, complete in-stream channel work. Phase 1, historic gravel mining left pits and ponds along the creek, and when water levels are low, adult and juvenile salmon would be stranded and die. Berms were built in key areas to prevent fish from reaching other pits. Phase 2, fill material was brought from an upstream site to fill some pits and plug others, which created over 67 acres of new floodplain, and 38 acres were replanted. At Restoration Grove, a 12-acre floodplain was constructed in an area previously a death trap for salmon and steelhead. Scour channels were designed to intercept spring groundwater to encourage recruitment of riparian vegetation. Riparian habitat was created specifically for songbirds and wildlife. Point Reyes Bird Observatory Conservation Science was hired to monitor bird populations nearby and in the restoration area, which guided the selection of species and density of plantings to encourage songbird species to nest in the area.
My name is Alicia Young. I'm an avian ecologist with PRBO Conservation Science. I've been monitoring the bird population, here's our male, along the Clear Creek restoration here for about 5 years now. Well, my day starts very early. I'm usually up at sunrise. I try to get out here at Clear Creek just 15 minutes after sunrise, and that's because actually bird activity is the greatest the first 3 or 4 hours after sunrise. I spend the majority of my day searching for nests. We have 5 focal species that we're targeting out here. We're really trying to see where they're nesting at Clear Creek, what habitat features they're using to nest in, what plant species they're using for nesting and foraging. So I would say the majority of my day is locating those nests, monitoring them, seeing how they're proceeding. Birds serve as a great indicator species. Not only are they high on the food chain, they're actually really easy to see, really easy to monitor. And specifically out here in a riparian forest, we're focusing on birds that represent different niches within the forest.
Tehama Environmental Solutions was hired to create the revegetation design and monitor the success of the plantings.
Normally, riparian vegetation in a stream system develops as a creek is meandering back and forth across a floodway. As a creek is eroding into one bank, it's usually creating a bar on the opposite bank. And that's where riparian vegetation will establish on those newly formed bars. And as the creek gets farther away, that bar will build up with finer soil, and that vegetation will build up and increase in size and stature. It's very important that we have a creek that meanders back and forth, moves around, snakes around, if you will, in order to create really high quality riparian habitat. Now, when we construct these new floodplains, we're actually essentially forcing riparian vegetation on a site that it really doesn't want to be, because that's not how it gets formed. But we need to do that because we're disturbing tens of acres at a time in each phase of work, and we're actually taking out riparian habitat when we do the project. So we need to at least replace what we've disturbed and hopefully create a little bit more to make it a little bit better than it was before. We have to have longer range goals in terms of this habitat developing into really good habitat. It'll probably take decades before it actually gets where we want it to be. So this is the initial planting that we implemented back in 2000. And so these trees are now 11 years old, going on their 12th growing season. We consider this one of our more successful plantings, and it's even more successful when you consider the fact that the soils here, even though you can't tell now, 12 years later, the soils are very sandy, very gravelly, so the trees are actually growing quite slow. So the fact that they're as large as they are now, we're very pleased with this. One of the things that we've learned is that these areas are tending to be used quite a bit by birds for feeding. There's a lot of insects here, and so they tend to come out and feed in these, but we don't see any nesting because a lot of the nesting habitat that they need is low cover from about your belt down to the ground. So in this particular case, we have a lot of cover up above, but we don't have a lot of that low cover. So we've actually come in after the fact, and now we've come in with a second planting where we're now planting some native blackberries and grapes and other vines and low shrubs to try to get some of that cover down in the bottom layer.
U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service surveys the creek during spawning season to determine where fish are nesting, what species have returned, and most importantly, the number of fish.
The adults will come up from the ocean, spawn, lay their eggs in the gravel. The eggs will stay in the gravel about 60 days. When those young hatch, they'll stay in the gravel and absorb their yolk sac and avoid predators that way just by staying in the gravel. So their nutrition comes from the yolk sac. Once the yolk sac is absorbed, then they'll come up from the gravel and they'll start moving downstream. In the Central Valley, the fall run Chinook in particular, we've got two sort of different lifestyles. One is a hatchery fish and one is a wild fish. And a lot of folks say, well, if you need more fish, just grow more fish in the hatchery. It's important to have these native wild fish in the mix with the hatchery fish. And one of the reasons for that is diversity. So all up and down the West Coast, Chinook salmon or steelhead that are hatched in a particular stream go to the ocean and have their own place they hang out. So a fish in Clear Creek feeds in a different area than, say, fish in Battle Creek. So the fish in Battle Creek are predominantly hatchery fish now because Coleman Hatchery is the largest fish hatchery in the nation, basically. I think there's a few in Alaska, might be bigger. So if they go to a pocket in the ocean that turns out to be not very productive that year, you could lose almost the entire run. You could lose, 90-something% of it. Where that particular year, the fish that are in Clear Creek might have gone to a different part of the ocean where productivity was a little better. Upwelling was different, not as many predators, whatever. So you need this diversity from each of these stream systems.
Phase 3 converted a barren bedrock channel back into a cobbled stream with natural gravel bars, pools, and riffles. Large root wad and tree structures protected the new bank and provided shelter for juvenile fish.
So I'm the restoration fisheries biologist for the Department of Fish and Game. My role has been to sort of guide the restoration so that it would be the most beneficial for anadromous fish. And there's a lot of components to that. It's not just how much spawning gravel you put in or how much water you put in. It's got to do with the whole ecosystem. These fish evolved by having a variety of habitats, having the spawning habitat, the holding habitat, by having good vegetation nearby for insect production. The small fish eat the insects, to grow to go to the ocean. So it's a whole ecosystem approach. So one of the things that we look at when we do a restoration project like this, basically all the vegetation you see around here wasn't here right after the project. I mean, this place looked like a big parking lot. So a lot of the stuff that's here was either replanted or came back on its own. Well, the structures behind us, we call them root wad structures, and they have two purposes. One is bank protection and one is habitat. Now, one of the interesting things about this structure, it was a learning experience for the engineers and the biologists. So we decided to do the root rod structures. I look at the plans, the geologists and the engineers look at the plans, and we all go, great, looks good. Okay, as a biologist, I'm not looking at elevations. So I come out here as they're putting them in, and I'm going, they're too high. They're not going to be in the water. And the engineer goes, well, they're not supposed to be in the water. They're supposed to be bank protection. And I go, no, they're supposed to be fish habitat. So fortunately, there was a bunch of gravel put into this section of the stream. During the first high flows, that gravel moved downstream, created a bar, or kind of a high spot in the river. It backed the water up into the root rod structures. So the root rod structures became fish habitat. So it's nature always wins. But as we designed more of these root rod structures for other phases of the project, we realized we needed two purposes. We needed bank protection, we needed fish habitat. So the new structures are built as like a two-story. So there's root rod structures low for fish habitat, and there's root rod structures high for bank protection. If you come here in the like in the early spring when the juvenile fish are still moving out, you'll see just schools and schools of juvenile salmon and trout around these structures because they're good protection from overhead predators like kingfishers, water predators like the Sacramento pike minnow. So the juvenile fish can hide up underneath these and the bigger fish can't get to them.
During the 15 years of restoration, over 100,000 tons of clean and properly sized spawning gravel was added at various locations along the creek. The irrigation diversion dam at Seltzer Gorge was removed in 2000, opening up 10 miles of creek for salmon spawning and the additional migration of spawning gravel. Through the cooperation of the Bureau of Reclamation, which controls water releases from Whiskeytown Dam, increased flows have been provided to benefit salmon migration. By 2006, over 16,000 salmon returned to spawn.
The 600 CFS flows are required, one in May and one in June, and they are for 3 days each. The 3,250 CFS flow, that's our objective there, is 7 years out of 10. That's to reach the peak for a 24-hour period.
The success to date has included increased fall run and spring run Chinook salmon, increased riparian habitat, reduced juvenile fish stranding, improved fish passage, increased spawning habitat.
Yeah, one of the things that's been really a nice surprise is the gravel work we've done. We know we have to put gravel in the creek to supply the creek with gravel so that it can create its own habitat. But when we place the gravel in the creek, we actually see the fish using it really quickly, and in areas where there is gravel, almost 100% of the spawning we see is in the injection gravel, is in the gravel we place there. So if you're giving the fish a choice in a certain area, they're unanimously using the gravel we're putting in there. We were putting different sizes of gravel in the creek, and we found that Chinook salmon weren't using one size that the steelhead we're using. Steelhead liked the smaller gravel, and the adult Chinook weren't using the smaller size gravel. So we changed our gravel sizes to adapt to that, and now the Chinook are using the spawning gravel that we're placing for them.
Salmon born in Clear Creek eventually migrate to the ocean, and after several years swim the 200 miles from the ocean up the Sacramento River to spawn in the creek where they were born, and then they die. Salmon eggs are buried in gravel beds, and then they hatch into fry and grow into juveniles. After a year or so, the young fish swim downstream to the ocean for several years before returning home to spawn and die.
Anadromous fish are more adaptable because they have different choices they can make of whether they go to the ocean at this age or at another age, or whether they don't go to the ocean at all. They have a bunch of different options they can use, and we need to provide habitat for them at different times of the year, different types of habitat, different depth water, different velocity water, so that those different strategies can work, can find a place to live in the creek.
One of the keys to long-term success is using an adaptive management feedback loop. Monitoring all aspects of the project is an educational endeavor that tells the technical team how the channel location and morphology adjust during high water flow events, the survival rate of the revegetation on the new floodplain, how many volunteer seedlings grow on the new floodplains, the relationship between water fluctuations and natural recruitment of vegetation, the density of bird species living in the new riparian habitats, and how many are successfully nesting and surviving, if there are any new areas of salmon stranding, and whether fish populations increasing or decreasing.
Plasticity is real important for these fish, that they can choose a different life history pattern that matches the changing conditions of the stream. If the stream's going to be hotter in the summer, then adopt a strategy of going out to the ocean rather than staying in the stream. That's maybe an option of being an anadromous steelhead rather than a resident rainbow trout. Or another life history strategy would be to stay in fresh water longer, like the late fall Chinook do, and out-migrate in the fall rather than the late spring, summer. So there's a lot of different patterns they could take, but if you don't provide a variety of habitats in the creek, you won't have those life forms. And the restoration attempts to provide all of the different habitats that could support those life history types. That's why we want to try to restore the form and function of the creek, because function of the creek is to transport sediment, to move water, and by doing that you create and maintain fish habitat, and you create a wide diversity of it that way that can then support many different life history patterns.
This powerful partnership has rehabilitated a magnificent creek and created a new legacy of stewardship in watershed restoration. The project also exemplifies the importance of education, outreach, and maintaining local support for such a high-profile project.
Horsetown Clear Creek Preserve is a local nonprofit. Each spring and each fall we coordinate a number of hikes or walks with an educational theme to them. Today we had a program on aquatic insects. Morgan Hannaford, who has a PhD in entomology and is an instructor out at the college, he's been coming out here for years and doing this event for us.
Unfortunately, it looks like it's nice for even the vertically challenged young people.
What he does is he comes out, talks a little bit about the stream and the health of the stream, as you can determine by the insects in the stream and the fisheries, locates those bugs and lets everybody get a good up-close look at what they are and talking about what they do.
Brachycentrids are probably also a majorly important caddisfly in Sacramento River. They're a huge filter feeder. They're a whole sister group to the moths and butterflies, but they spin silk, just like a moth would, to make a cocoon. But that silk is waterproof when it's initially made. They collect little chunks of wood, little chunks of organic material, and they build a case, but it's kind of cool as the case is square in profile. And very few square things in nature, if you think about it. But this one makes a square case. What these brachycentrids do is they stick their legs out like this, and they spin silk in their legs like a cat's cradle. You know, what you played with when you were a little kid or whatever, cat's cradles. And what happens is the organic material comes down and gets stuck on the web, and they eat it off of the web there. So they're a filter feeder, but they actually can move around.
It's one of the events that's real popular with the kids. They enjoy getting out. Anything bugs and water related is a kid event.
Oh, I'm just going to be right here. Where's the dragonfly larva? Right there. It needs water. I caught a live dragonfly larva.
What's kind of fun to do with a pan like this is just to kind of sit and just watch the pan. What's really interesting is once those pupate, usually in late July, the stream ends up a lot more algae growing on the rocks because there's nothing left to kind of scrape it off.
I'd like to stress that one of the things Horsetown does is we provide that citizen involvement. We're the public-private partnership, and we're able to get people out here in a different way to enjoy an event.
But this is great to see so many adults out here at this time.
And learn about what is going on, particularly with the salmon restoration. And although we focus a lot of our events here on the property that we own, we also lead hikes on the public lands above us and below us and get people out to where they have an opportunity to learn about a new trail that's been built recently that they otherwise might not know about.
The community was kept informed, provided input, and everyone was able to expand their understanding about watershed ecosystems. The technical advisory team is still at work, planning the future for Lower Clear Creek. Another phase may be added to protect the downstream area of the project. Additional funds for spawning gravel will be needed, invasive species kept under control, and fish surveys conducted to track long-term benefits.
Well, the work that remains to be done includes providing that gravel in perpetuity. We'll always need to have gravel added to Clear Creek because Whiskeytown blocks the gravel supply from upstream. And along that same line, getting a long-term gravel supply is important. Also, attaining high flows in Clear Creek is important because they're what actually moves the gravel into place and creates the habitat and maintains that habitat.
So before I got involved in this project, I used to guide salmon trips on the Sacramento River here locally. And some of my good friends who are still guiding actually lost their livelihoods overnight a couple years ago when the Sacramento River salmon populations crashed.
One thing to keep in mind is in the last few years there hasn't been a commercial fishery on the West Coast. Due to the collapse of the fall run fishery, that equation isn't quite the same anymore.
To me, it makes the importance of what we're doing even greater in that we really can't afford to try to just keep these populations from moving backwards. We really have to restore enough habitat in order to get these populations restored and increased so that we can get some of these businesses up and running again.
Yeah, the economic importance of these salmon and steelhead was looked at by the Natural Resources Conservation Service back in about 2001. So we looked at the number of fish that we were producing in Clear Creek due to the restoration. And we multiplied that by the value that those fish represented in the local and the coastal economy. And we estimated that about $1.5 million of additional money was coming into the economy in Redding and on the coast, and on an annual basis, which was, at that time, was more than we were spending on the restoration.
There are jobs that are tied to salmon and tourism and all these other things that are very important.
There's an economic impact of the projects themselves and also from the fish that the projects are producing.
And now the people are invited back to the watershed to hike, enjoy a fitness course, horseback ride, picnic, view educational exhibits, and the best part, stand on the new overlook into the canyon and watch the native salmon naturally spawn.
It's kind of ironic that I got involved in it in the first place. My grandfather actually operated one of the gold dredges here in Clear Creek in 1940. And so I sort of feel like I'm closing out a loop by coming back some 70 years later and helping to restore a mine site that he worked on.
Major funding for Devastation to Restoration provided by the Bureau of Reclamation and the Bureau of Land Management. Additional funding provided by Horsedown Clear Creek Preserve.